Hey everybody, Ron Burke, Editor-in-Chief for GamingTrend.com. Today we're going to assemble what can only be described as an absolutely obscene build. We're going to take this 12th gen Intel processor, a 12900K, put it inside this, a Z690 Aorus master motherboard, power it with this 1000 watt EVGA power supply, cool it with this 280mm Be Quiet Pure Loop AIO, graphically power it with this NVIDIA RTX 3090, and put it all inside this, the Darkbase Pro 900 Rev 2. We've got a lot to unbox and a whole lot to do, so let's get started. Now the fine folks at FedEx did their level best to destroy this on the way to GT headquarters, and I haven't even taken off this shroud, so let's find out if the packaging is good, or if I'm about to swear a whole lot. Thankfully, intact. Before we get too far into this, I want to address something up front. This case will set you back $250. Now before you run screaming from the room, let me give you some philosophy on that. There are certain things that you use every single day. A solid desk, a comfortable chair, a high refresh monitor to avoid headaches, a case to house your equipment and keep it cool. Those things are important to invest in because they're going to last you more than one generation of build. So let's dig into this a little bit further and see if it can justify that price. I've taken the liberty of removing the zip ties so we can get at the accessories and the LED strips. So these are a solid set of strips and unfortunately stickers. Come on guys, magnets, not stickers. All right, so we'll set those aside for now. Box. All right, so looks like hard drive cages on this side. Our screws. These look like SSD trays, some sort of bracket, and another hard drive cage. So if you are planning on using spinning platters, clearly you've got some options. Since we're on the topic of LEDs and fans, here's the header for that. Unlike its predecessor, which only had 4, this one now has 8 headers for fans, which you can see right here. And this is also where your LEDs are going to plug in. The nice part is that this is universally compatible, so any 4-pin LED can plug in here, so you can light this thing up to make it look completely insane if you're so inclined. Now one of the reasons I fell in love with this particular case, and you're going to hear this a lot, is modularity. So here's a good example. Perhaps you want to throw some hard drives in here, or here, or here, or here, or here. There's 5 slots for those. Don't want them? You can always remove them. Before we move on from this, I want to point out that these rubber grommets here, those are sound dampening. So when you mount a hard drive here, that rumble when you hear a hard drive spin up, that should be completely isolated by these. The next trick that this particular case can pull is going to require we pull a few screws. Again, these have a rubber grommet in them, so any screws are dampened from any vibration. I've rotated this around so you can see one of the best tricks for this particular system. This board can be moved up and down, it can be rotated, and my favorite, this can all be removed so you can assemble outside the case, which is exactly what we're going to do. Another addition to this particular revision to the case is this power supply shroud. So there's a screw back here, one there, and 2 in the front. This whole assembly comes off. Now I find this to be particularly useful because it lets me get into the power supply without a whole lot of impedance. It's also worth noting that these little panels come off and there are vents there, so if you're concerned about cooling, there's no need to be. Now placing your power supply inside this case, you may wish to place it in a number of different areas, and Be Quiet was nice enough to include this little cable so you can plug it in wherever you need to and still have access to the power port in the back. I laid the case on its back so you can see inside the top. Now, I think you could fit a 360mm cooler in there. I think you just have to remove this particular hard drive cage. Now, obviously, we've got hard drive cages elsewhere, so if you intend to use spinning platters, just move them somewhere else. This does remove, it is modular. I think the 280mm Be Quiet is gonna fit in here just fine. While we do have it sitting on its back, there is another feature that I find interesting. This is a rapid charger for a cell phone or really any other device that'll take rapid charge. Simply by laying your phone there, it will, as long as your phone supports rapid charging, it'll charge up via that port. No cables required. It's kind of nice. I don't know how useful it'll be, but I guess we'll see. Headed to the front of the case, there's a pair of magnetic spring locks to hold the door in place with some more of that acoustic dampening material. Inside, there's a pair of 140mm Silent Wing 3 fans. Those run at 1600 RPMs compared to the previous model, which ran at 1000. So it'll be interesting to see kind of the interplay between cooling and acoustic dampening. They are PWM, which means pulse width modulation. They can be directly controlled through the variable rate module up here, which we'll get into in just a minute. Now, all these features are great, but none of it matters if putting the thing together is a giant pain in the ass. So let's start putting this together. Now, I've been building PCs all the way back to when Packard Bell thought they were cool, so I'm gonna offer some tips as we go. First and foremost, I'm standing on an anti-static mat. If you're using any sort of electronics, you may wanna use a wrist strap to ground yourself. There's also another thing, so I'm gonna open up this Aorus Master motherboard. Pardon the crinkly plastic for a moment. Goodness gracious, this thing's heavy. All right, so before we go over the motherboard, there's a common thing that I see in a lot of build videos that is just a huge no-no. So you'll see a lot of people set their motherboard, I'm just gonna set it down here for a moment. They'll set it on top of their case, their board box, which I'm just emptying here real quick. And that's perfectly fine. In fact, it makes a good non-conductive surface, so that's great. So that's perfectly fine. You can set your motherboard on top of this. The mistake that I see is people will take their motherboard out of the case, and the next thing that they're gonna do is they set this anti-static bag on top and then put the motherboard on it. The outside of this bag is a conductive material. You don't want to put your non-conductive conducting thing on top of this. So directly on top of the box is perfectly fine. So this really isn't a review of the Aorus Master, but we'll kind of go over what's in the box. Obviously the motherboard. Here's a screw that looks like that's a M.2 screw. Those are always handy. I've had to order those. They're shockingly expensive. This is an audio sensor. So this can measure sound inside the case and throttle your fans accordingly, unless I'm mistaken. This is for the Wi-Fi. Looks like another M.2 screw, which is good because this thing has a whole lot of M.2 space. G connector. This is for your leads that go to the motherboard here. They'll go right here in the back and connect to the front of the case. We'll get into that. Another M.2 screw, another M.2 screw, some hard drive cables. I think that's an LED cable, another hard drive cable, and these are thermal sensors. So we're gonna set all those aside. We're gonna go back to these. So another thing that I see commonly as a mistake in builds is people will reuse their connectors for their hard drives. That is an incredibly bad idea. These are shockingly cheap, and it takes almost nothing to break them. And so if you start seeing spotty performance or weird disconnects, this is probably your culprit. Do not reuse these. We're gonna take a closer look at this Aorus motherboard, but I also wanna point out something. I have the motherboard manual open almost the whole time that I'm doing a build. There's no sort of weird masculinity prize that's gonna arrive in the mail if you manage to do this without ever looking at this. Nobody's watching, well, you guys are watching, but I don't have any problems about it either. Use the damn manual, that's why it's in the box. First and foremost, this is an LGA 1700 socket, so only the Intel 12th gen processors are going to work in this motherboard. This motherboard has 4 DDR5 slots. Those are 288 pins, but you'll notice that there's a little bit of a different keying on these than DDR4. There's also some fundamental architectural differences. DDR4 uses one 64-bit lane to push information around your system. Now, you're not always going to have instructions that are exactly 64 bits long, so there's a very good chance that some of that top end of that particular pipeline is filled with just pointers, garbage basically. So DDR5 switches to two 32-bit lanes, so in effect you're getting roughly 50% more bandwidth to push things around your system. With Windows 11 and direct storage, supposedly there'll be an ability to bypass some of the to the processor and back, to the GPU and back, and just simply write directly from memory to the GPU or directly to storage. We'll have to see how that plays out in Windows 11 when we do additional testing. I swear every motherboard manufacturer decided to make about 6 different variants of their motherboards. So this particular one has a number of M.2 slots underneath this thermal guard here. So let's take a moment and open it up. To talk about M.2, we have to talk about PCIe lanes. So the big draw with this particular motherboard is that it's future-proof. It's PCI Express 5.0. PCI Express 5.0 has 20 PCIe lanes, 16 of which are dedicated directly to this graphics card slot. So that's where you're gonna put your primary graphics card, regardless of whether it's a 3060 or a 3090 or whatever 4000 series eventually comes, that's where it's gonna go. So with 20 lanes, we get to this particular M.2 slot. This M.2 slot is tied directly to the CPU, so it doesn't have to go back through the chipset and allows for direct communication between the two. So 20 lanes means 16 can be devoted to your video card and the remainder can be devoted directly to that M.2 slot. You probably picked up this motherboard because you liked all the expansion slots. Maybe you want to run a completely SSD system, but you'll probably notice that there's some differences between these. So this one is PCIe 4.0, 4.0, 4.0, 4.0, and 3.0. And there's something different about this particular one that you should also know. So obviously you can use this for storage, but it is 3.0, and it also shares memory with this particular slot. Now you can use this slot, there's nothing stopping you from doing that, but it's worth noting that it does share bandwidth with this particular lane. So if you occupy this, I'm not sure if it will disable it or if the performance will simply suck, but I might recommend against using that particular M.2 slot if you're gonna occupy this. I like to test my boards outside of a case first. So I like this. This is a small power button and a small LED. This allows me to turn on the system without needing to connect it to a case, and this little LED gives me lots of valuable information without even connecting it to a screen. This board also has multiple USB 3.2 headers. So there's 2 right here, and then 2 more standard USB connectors right here. If you're into RGB, there's 2 connectors right here, and then 2 more connectors right here for LED. That noise sensor I mentioned earlier goes right here, and we see the start of some system fans right here, here, and here. If you're using a cooling pump or a heat pump, there is a connector right here for that. That G connector that lets you connect all of your case's front wiring very quickly, that goes right here. There are 6 SATA ports right here to connect any hard drives or optical drives that you might have. Just above those PCIe slots, we see 2 Thunderbolt connectors. This little guy right here is very important. That is a USB Type-C header with USB 3.2 Gen 2x2 support. So that is your highest speed port on this motherboard. Right here is the thermal detection header. We'll plug in our cable there, and our second temperature lead is right here. I'll spare you the walk around on the fans, but suffice it to say there's a CPU fan here, there is a system fan up here, there are 2 more system fans here and here, there's a pump fan here, There's another system fan here and a second one all the way up here. There's a total of 8 connectors, so you've got plenty of optional fans that you can hook up for as much cooling via air as you'd like to push into your system. A quick look at the back and you can see there is a ton of options here. This Q flash button here allows you to update the BIOS with the power connector connected, but when the system's not powered on. Useful for when you've really tanked your system. Similarly, the clear CMOS button here, also useful in that kind of circumstance when you need to really take things back down to the lowest level. These 2 connectors right here go to that fin looking antenna that I mentioned earlier. That connects up to the Intel Wi-Fi 6E AX210. It supports Wi-Fi A, B, G, N, AC, AX, Bluetooth 5.2, and up to 2.6 gigabits per second for data transfer. So not many of us have that kind of bandwidth, but I suppose, again, future-proofing. This port's a bit of a change. Gigabit Ethernet has been the standard for quite some time now, but we're starting to see motherboards move towards this, which is a 10 gig port. Not a great many of us have switches capable of 10 gigs, but right there you go. Obviously, again, future-proofing. Now we're gonna get into something that really irks me, USB. So these ports right here are USB 3.2 Gen 1, better known as super speed. You might see SS on the side of your USB cord. These are for those ports. Better just to say that these are capable of 5 gigabits per second. Moving down the line, we have these 4 red ports. Those are USB 3.2 Gen 2, also known as Super Speed Plus, because, again, why not? Suffice it to say, these are double the speed of these, so these are 10 gigabits per second. Moving down, we see the display port, and then we have these 2 USB-C ports, but they are not the same, because why not confuse things further, right? So this one is a USB Type-C 3.2 Gen 2, which again means that it is capable of 10 gigabits per second. This one, on the other hand, is USB Type-C 3.2 Gen 2x2. What does that mean? Well, that means it's capable of 20 gigs per second. So that is your fastest port, located all the way down here at the bottom, where most people are probably going to use any one of these before they use this. And rounding things out, just like these red ports here, this one's the same thing. It's also USB 3.2 Gen 2. Popping back to the display port for just a moment, it's worth noting that this is capable of 4K 60, so it can handle 4096 by 2304 at 60 Hertz, and it's also capable of HDCP 2.3 if you happen to be using any sort of onboard, or if you have a secondary monitor that you're running literally just off of the chipset. Last but not least, your audio ports are fairly typical, including the optical SPDIF out. Let's just get this out of the way. So this is Intel's new 12th gen i9 processor. I do like the packaging. It's better than just the plain box. This is what the die would look like if it was being manufactured. So let's get out the knife, open this up, and get that processor out. So I went ahead and unboxed the Be Quiet Pure Loop cooler because crinkling plastic is annoying on camera. So it ships with a box full of parts. We're gonna leave all those in there, more than likely. We'll take a look anyway. Some cabling, might need those, some zip ties. But because this is for this particular chipset and it's new, you'll have to reach out to Be Quiet for an LGA 1700 mounting kit. They're happy enough to provide that free of charge if you can provide them with a receipt that shows that you've actually purchased a system with a 12th gen processor. So this particular model comes with some Be Quiet fans. They are PureWing 2s, so they're the predecessor to the ones that are in the case already. But these are gonna go on the AIO. The AIO stands for all-in-one. No magic there. So we'll mount the fans on this, actually on this side. Then this will mount on the cooler, or on the processor itself. And then right there has this little badge that goes on top. and we'll be off to the races. This is the coolant. There is a fill pour spout on this for you to fill this radiator, but it is pretty much a self-contained system. So once you fill it, you should be good to go. I've actually never had to refill one, so at least they give you the equipment to do so. So be right back. I'm gonna go ahead and assemble all this because that's really not worth watching. There is one thing I will point out on these. You'll notice that I've mounted these with the Be Quiet logo upward. So that gets your fans rotating in the correct direction so they pull air through the radiator. So I've taken all the mounting equipment out, and I want to point something out because I feel like the Be Quiet folks know something that we don't. That says Intel 17XX, so 1700 series, but then also says 1800 series. So it seems like Intel's already well ahead of the curve and working on their next form factor for their processors. So you might be thinking to yourself, we're starting to get into this chaotic period where we've got a ton of screws. I've got screws over here for the case, I've got screws over here for the AIO, I've got screws for the motherboard mounts. What do I do with all this? Here's another tip from somebody who's been building a long time. These are called ramekins. They're normally used for things like bundt cakes. These are great for holding screws, so I'm gonna open up all my mount screws. And there they go. And now I know where they are. And I know that they won't get lost. Okay, you'll notice I have the instructions out again because, again, there are no heroes in this. Having the instructions out where you can see them is the best way to assemble anything. So with that out of the way, this is the bottom plate that will go underneath, and then these two little wings are the standoffs for mounting the AIO. So this is gonna go underneath. You'll notice that there are 4 little holes right here. Again, if you've never done one of these, it can be intimidating. Don't be intimidated. Okay, so we've got the screws and the little rubber grommets going through here. We need to put them on here and we need to flip it over, right? Well, how do you do that without these falling out? Here's another trick you can take from somebody who's built hundreds and hundreds of systems. I've not seen anybody else use this trick, but I always have painter's tape. Specifically painter's tape because it doesn't have the same sticky material that any other tape does. So you can safely tape down this bracket without having to worry about any sticky stuff being on the board, and it will come off very easily. But it allows me to flip it over and all of the posts stayed exactly where I need them to be. Why make things hard for yourself, right? Now remember I said before we actually mount the cooler on top of the processor, we're going to need to do something else. And that specifically is adding some cooling material. So I personally like Arctic Silver. There are a lot of different techniques for this, but generally speaking, the golden rule is dead center, about the size of a large grain of rice. There are people that do all sorts of weird crosses and X's and stuff like that. I personally just like to put down some and call it a day. That was terrible. So you'll probably notice that my thermal paste had some squigglies. You don't have to worry about that at all. That's not going to cause you any grief. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pull out our AIO and we're going to get that mounted. So you'll remember that this has a protective film over the top of this. So we're going to tear off this tape. It keeps that surface clean and scratch free. That's the first one I've seen with tape, but that works. So before we get started, I want to point something out about this particular AIO. So there are a couple of component names that you need to know. This is the cold plate, which is kind of a self-explanatory thing. And then normally in an AIO, you have a cold plate and inside of it is also the pump. So there's been a lot of debate about where the pump should live, whether it should be inside the cold plate or if it should be inside the radiator. But if you put it inside the radiator, then all of a sudden you've got weird issues with it sticking out, causing problems with mounting. Be Quiet went a completely different direction. So if you look back here, you see this small square right here. That's the pump. So there's a lot of debate about how you orient this and whether or not it has to be perfectly in line with the rear part of the pump, and then how much twist you can have inside these tubes. And all of that alignment has to do with both wear and tear and a little bit to do with cooling. But mostly, if you get out of alignment with the cold plate slash pump and the radiator itself, you can have air get inside the system. Now, there is no such thing as a perfectly closed system. You'd have to have a vacuum, and that's just not a thing, right? And certainly not for any sort of reasonably priced cooler. So the best we can do is make sure that the pump remains in line with the radiator. In this case, we can put this AIO cold plate just about anywhere because it has the pump already directly in line with the rear of the radiator. So you don't have to worry with this particular model about kind of, which side are you going to mount it on? Are you going to mount it up or in the front of the case? All of that is very possible because of where they put the pump. So that is a huge advantage. If you're looking for an AIO, there's definitely cheaper ones out there, but this makes it worth the price. So I'll shut up now. Let's mount this thing. So I'm not afraid to admit a mistake, although this really is not a mistake, but more of a preference. I wanted to change the orientation a little bit. I realized that I could still get the clearance that I needed for my memory while getting this mounted sideways like this, which would put less restriction on the tubes with the way that we're going to mount it in the case. So I went ahead and readjusted, reapplied my thermal paste. All the same rules apply. The nice part is this particular mounting kit can be used either way, meaning there's really no wrong way to do this. It's also going to depend on the thing we discussed earlier about where that pump lives. So you'll have to do this according to your own personal build as well. We are right tight, ready to go. Again, one of the features I love about the Darkbase Pro is the ability to take out this motherboard tray. As I mentioned, it is ATX, Mini ITX, eATX, Flex ATX, Micro ATX. I mean, pretty much any board you can buy will fit in this case in some way. Another thing that I like is that these hold-offs are already installed and they are non-removable. The amount of times that I've had something get stuck in one of these is too much to count, where you're trying to figure out how you can get a screw loose and it's stripping the brass. These are part of the system, so no chance of that. So let's go ahead and start moving the motherboard onto this and start mounting it up. All right, I've prepped all the screws with mainboard insulation washers. So it's time to start moving the mainboard. So let's do that. All right, everything's all aligned. I'm gonna start locking it down. This red screwdriver, by the way, is a non-magnetic screwdriver, which is what you should be using for your board assemblies. While it's more convenient to be able to grab a screw with a magnetic screwdriver, you're just asking for trouble when dealing with electronics. I've also seen some people use a power drill, which just really sets my teeth on edge. The amount of torque that one of those drills can put out is significant. You screw that up once, you'll never use it again. The board, or the drill, for that matter. We're going to leave that one out, considering we've not put our hard drives in quite yet. We'll come back to that one. Actually, it looks like I can get to that with the thermal pad out, so I guess we'll just go ahead and mount it. All right, let's start getting this into the case. There is one other thing we need to attend to before we button this up to put it in the case, and that's storage. So you've seen the Seagate FireCuda 530 before. We put one of these in our PlayStation 5. Now it's going to serve as the primary storage platform for this system. With transfer rates of 7 gigs per second, it's definitely the way to go. So first things first, and never forget to do this, you need to remove this protective sleeve. This little thing will get in the way of any sort of thermal transfer. While the drive may work, it's definitely not going to be happy about it. And you won't either. So before we get rolling, a couple more pro tips. I've put a tiny bit of sticky material on the end of this screwdriver so I can grab things with it, because it is also not magnetized. Before I do anything else, that may look like a screw, it's not. That's a hold off. So you're going to want to make sure that that's nice and tight. The last thing you want to do is tighten this in there and have the screw, this tiny little one here, somehow tighten that, and then when you go to remove it, it takes the post out as well. So on this drive, you can see there's a small notch there. There's a corresponding notch right there on the M.2 slot. This just tucks in just a little bit, and that's it. It should stick up like you see there. We're gonna grab this small screw. This is again why we put that little tacky material on there. We're gonna push this down, and it's now ready to go. You can put this you can put this heat sink on and lock that down, and you'll be off to the races. But what did I just say? Don't forget to remove these. That is going to be a sticky material, so make sure you kind of get it on the first try. The second drive I'm going to put in is an Intel 670p. This is a 2 terabyte drive that I'm going to use for storage. It's a Gen 3 drive, but again, it's just for storage. So we're going to follow the same process and make sure that's nice and tight. I'm going to pull off this little plastic film very carefully. I'm going to grab another one of these screws that were included in the bag for the M.2 drives. It is nice of them to include them. I've definitely had to hunt them down. They are not easy to find. Same deal as before. There's a small notch to correspond with this small notch. Push that in place. Stick this screw onto the end, push it down. And lock it in place. It's as easy as that. Make sure you take off the corresponding pad cover, and if you're going to install any other drives, now's the time to do that. Easily one of the most crucial parts of your entire system is the power supply. This is literally the heart of everything that you're going to be doing, so you want to feed it well. I would have gone with a Be Cool power supply, but you know, you can only go with what's in stock. The issues with shipping continue to rear their ugly head. So EVGA, very much a trusted standard. So here's the manual that nobody's gonna read. Big bundle of cables. We'll be making use of those. Big bundle of cables. Main board cable. Oh, these are for hard drives. I am actually going to run a RAID of spinning disks in this, so that will be important. And looks like an adapter, and of course the power supply itself. So I like modular power supplies. I'll flip this over so you can read. I like being able to only plug in the cables that I need. If you're going to build a system from scratch, buy a modular power supply. Your cable management efforts will thank you. Before we mount the PSU, I want to take the liberty of showing you another way in which this particular case is very flexible. There are 4 screws in the bottom here, as well as 2 on this side plate that I've already removed. I also removed these 4 post screws to remove these plates. You'll see why in a minute. So sliding this forward, you can remove the drive cage. So the drive cage, obviously the drive is going to mount, I'm sorry, not the drive cage, the power supply cage is going to mount here in the back. And with this, you can move your case mounts for the power supply. You can move them forward, you can move them all the way to the back of the case, you can move it to the other side, or when you do an inverted build, you can also invert this. Obviously you'd have to move this arm to the other side. You can also invert the power supply in case you wanted to mount it that way. There is an intake here, so that is very viable. It really just depends on what your particular setup is. Whatever you choose, just make sure you've got it well mounted so there's no vibration. Power supply is mounted. I promise you there's no draw the rest of the owl nonsense going on. All I did was spin in some screws. We're going to plug in this part of the power lead and remount all of these to the back of the case, which looks like so. 4 screws later, and this will be back in position. Before you go mounting this, you're going to want to hit the switches because they'll be kind of painful to get to otherwise. Before we can mount the cooler, we're going to need to take the top off the case. So reaching underneath, I'll show you a picture here in just a second, there are some latches. I've gone ahead and removed those, but I'll show you again right here. These small little latches right here, you just squeeze those in and the whole assembly comes off with more than a little bit of force than you might expect. With that off, we'll be able to easily mount our cooler and start to mount the motherboard. All right, so a little bit of a trick before we mount this. I went ahead and moved all the cables out of the way, and I've set the radiator inside. I'm trying not to drop this. I'm gonna put this in place, but the first thing I'm gonna do, because of these little rubber grommets, you can see these little orange grommets here, they will hold these screws. So I'm gonna put all of my screws into the rubber grommets so I can very quickly mount them. Obviously this is much easier if you've got a second person to help, but in a pinch, this is how you do it. Oh, what happened, right? All right, so using the tabs, I took off the front. 4 screws allows me to move this out of the way, that entire assembly. Then 4 screws here and 2 screws up top are gonna let me take out this cage. If you were thinking you might wanna use an optical drive, I would ask, for what? I've kind of been done with optical drives for a while. But in this case, we actually have a different purpose for taking it out. This particular motherboard, the very top of it, even with the, there we go, even with the system completely slid down, I suppose I could slide it lower, but this gets in the way of the radiator. So we're gonna remove that. Thank you again for the flexibility. And then we'll be able to properly mount our radiator all the way up front. I'm gonna spin this around, we'll check it out. See, with that whole piece removed, now we're able to swing the radiator around and mount it appropriately, though not like that. We're gonna spin it back around. But that's gonna be a challenge no matter what. Despite my best efforts, there simply is no way to mount this large of an AIO in here with this heat riser up top. That may be a consequence of 12th gen Intel processor systems, but it simply will not fit without the risk of bending pins or worse. So, again, thank you Flexible. We're gonna move these fans down here, remount them at the bottom, and then we'll have plenty of space to move the AIO to the front. Now you might take one look at this panel and think, oh no, I don't want to deal with that. I'm just going to plug everything into the board. Well, don't be intimidated by this. The good news is, like here's an LED strip. It'll only plug in one way and it'll only plug in one spot. So it simply slides in, locks in place, and that's it. The 4 fans connect here or here, either side is fine. And then this simply connects to the motherboard. It really is that simple. Now almost every board manufacturer is probably going to include these. You can slip these in like this to secure your wires, but this is something hard against something that carries current. It's very easy to over tighten these. Instead, I like to use these. I'll leave a link in the description, but do yourself a favor, pick up some of these. These Velcro strips make much better cable ties, and you can reopen them and add more wires or secure them any way you wish, rather than something zip tied, which once you zip it closed, it's done. Now we're gonna button up the case, put everything back together, and then we'll start wiring it up for power. So I'm just finishing up getting this last couple of screws locked down for this top part. I've already routed the cables to the back. I do like this about the Darkbase Pro 900. This raceway makes it very easy to run your cables cleanly. Aesthetics aside, that doesn't necessarily matter because you're probably not gonna have this shown off to anybody other than your spouse who probably doesn't care. But this sort of thing also helps you when you want to change out a part. If you can't tell where the cables are going because you've got this jumbled mess behind your case, it's a nightmare. Do yourself a favor, take the time, it's 15 minutes, route your cables cleanly, make it look nice, there's less chance of it getting pinched, it's better for airflow, and you'll thank me later when you need to swap a part. Now you might remember this little bag here. It says G connector. This little connector is a godsend. You used to have to try and fight with these particular wires right here. So this little bundle of wires is your power switch, it's your hard drive connector, it's pretty much all your LEDs and your power switch. And somewhere in here there's also something for the motherboard's speaker, in theory. So all of that goes into this handy dandy little connector here, and that just plugs into the motherboard in one easy shot rather than having to fish each cable in. So it's nice that more motherboard manufacturers are including these, and it sure does make assembly easy. So coming off the top of the case, you have these 3 cables that look remarkably similar, but they're not quite the same. So this one is 3 pins, this one is 2 pins, and this one is 2 pins and slightly smaller. Thankfully, much like everything else on this board, I should say everything else in this case, this can only go in one place. So this 3-pin connector goes up here, and that is for the key charger, the rapid charger that's on top of the device. This smaller one can only plug in there, and this 3rd one can only connect here. They've made it simple to ensure you cannot screw this up. So rest assured, even if this is your first build, this case has got you covered. Well, it's not perfect, but it certainly does the job. I've got 2 cables that aren't secured yet. These are 2 power connectors for the case itself and for the LEDs, but everything else is routed and clean. Again, these aren't pulled tight at all. They're simply holding things in place, which is the objective. You don't want to zip tie things tight or Velcro strip things tight. The inside of the case looks good. I may still have to do a little bit of cable management to get things completely clean. I do want to point out that the pump for the AIO is sitting slightly lower than the top part of the radiator. This is really important because bubbles can accumulate inside your cooler. There's no such thing as a perfect vacuum in any AIO, so over time with evaporation, you may lose some fluid. After about 2 years is what the recommendation is from Be Quiet, that you use the included fluid to top it off. But with that pump, if it was higher, you could have air bubbles that cause cavitation. That's a noise problem as well as a heat problem. So make sure that any AIO that you use, whether it's Be Quiet or somebody else, make sure that this pump always sits lower than the top part of the radiator. I am going to do a little bit of that, draw the rest of the owl bit. I'm going to put in all of the power cabling from our PSU and get it all cleanly wired up to the board. Now, as you're routing cables, you may be tempted to go over the top of this rail. You need to go through these channels because if you go too far out from here, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting the case back on. So do yourself a favor. When you can, go through the little channel in between the motherboard and this outside rail and try and just keep your cable pushed to a minimum. On the other side, so we've got all of our cabling for the video card, motherboard's connected, 2 power connectors up here are connected, and we've got one small SATA mess down here. That's to connect the LEDs, so we'll secure those underneath the cage when we put the shroud back on and make sure that it stays out from underneath any fans or anything weird like that. So a little bit more cable work to go and we'll be ready to put the video card in. Now you might remember that we pulled this shroud out from underneath the bottom part of this, and you'll notice there's no venting. So we're going to want to alleviate some of the air restriction. You can pop off some of these, which would allow you to mount this the other way around if you were so inclined. I just like a little bit more airflow. So let's pop these off and put the shroud back in. So as we go to mount the shroud, you'll notice it's too big. Well, again, with the modularity of this, that part comes off, right around the fans it'll go. All right, this is pretty much the beefiest card I could put in this system. The RTX 3090. Not precisely a gaming card per se, and it's obviously big. It takes 3 slots, but there's nothing more powerful out there. So we're gonna prep the case, pull out these 3 screws, mount this, cable it, and we'll fade right back. It'll be like a training montage. Like all 3000 series cards, this does use a special adapter, which plugs in right there, and your 2 power leads connect into that. These power leads do not come off a splitter. They are directly to the PSU, which is recommended good practice. You don't want to be using a splitter, especially with a card that draws this much power. We're going to pause here. You may have noticed that we didn't put any RAM in the system, and that's because there isn't any. The supply chain problems that have plagued pretty much every other chip-driven system has also affected DRAM, and DDR5 is extraordinarily hard to find right now. So it's going to be somewhere between a week and 36 weeks for me, and a blink of an eye for you. So I'll probably be wearing a different shirt and maybe slightly more gray when we come back. So fade to black. Be back soon. Well, it was just a few seconds for you, but it was 5 weeks for me. Non-stop battering of now in stock finally got me some Trident Z5 memory. It's DDR5 6000 at CL 40/40/40/76 at 1.3 volts. It's a pair of 16 gig sticks, so that'll start me off on plenty of RAM for this build. I do want to point out something though. Remember how I said use magnets, not sticky stuff? Well, in the 5 weeks since we put this together, this has already fallen off. So Perhaps for the dark Rev 3, let's move to magnets instead of sticky crap. All right, so let's open this up and get it inside the machine. So we want to make sure that we install this in the right memory slot. So that's going to be these two modules. You don't simply put them in sequentially. When you're only using 2 sticks, you're going to put it in DDR5 A2 and B2, which is the 2nd slot here and this 4th slot. Now these are the same amount of pins, but they are not the same key. So don't try and force in DDR4 as much as it might be painful to wait for DDR5 memory. These only go in one way, and they snap in place with a satisfying click. So obviously we're in a bit of a different place now. If you haven't gotten yourself a sit-stand desk that you can raise with the push of a button, I highly recommend it for working on PCs. Nothing better than being able to lay the system down and work in it, then raise it back up. So the system would not boot, just would not. Blue screen here, completely dead. I can only imagine that there was somebody chasing after the factory as they were packaging up this motherboard, because they shipped it with a motherboard BIOS that does not support NVMe. So formatting one thumbstick and then using this Q flash button, I was able to flash it to the most recent BIOS, which allowed the NVMe drives to come up. And obviously the system now boots. So we're gonna button it up properly, and we're gonna take off the plastic at the end here. I'm gonna remove power, because you never wanna remove something like that plastic film while there's power connected to the device. So stand by 1 second. So before we power it back up, I wanna point something else out since I've been offering tips this whole time. You'll notice that I have this power brick here that I've plugged everything into. You never know when you might accidentally let out the magic smoke on your device, so it's best if you can have something that you can hit a single switch and kill all power. So just another tip from having built entirely too many machines. Let's go ahead and power this up. So while this boots, I want to talk a little bit about the case itself. A case is completely worthless if it's a pain to build in. And thankfully, that has not been the case with this particular one from Be Quiet. As you can hear, no real noise from it, which, I mean, kind of tracks with the name Be Quiet. It was very easy to work inside, and that was good because I've got this mismatch of components from different vendors, and I've had to make all sorts of little adjustments to get this device up and running. From the size of the RTX 3090 to the way that the cooler was placed, everything presented a challenge, and none of it was too much for this case. Because of the modularity, I was able to move devices as I saw fit. I was able to reconfigure the insides of the case. I even got 2 mechanical drives in here that you can't see that are loaded right here in the back and the bottom. So an incredibly flexible case and a vast improvement over its predecessor. I think I'm going to be pretty happy with this, and probably for quite a few builds from now. So I've been Ron Burke, Editor-in-Chief for GamingTrend.com. I hope you got something out of this build, and we'll see you again very soon.